welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C. It is the afternoon of Friday, July 5th, 2013, and the world is in ferment, and some tendencies are positive, and we should look, first of all, at the close connection between the events in Egypt, the military coup, which has overthrown Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, connection between that event and the continuing turn of the civil war in Syria. These countries are closely linked. They were one country, at least formally speaking. They were the United Arab Republic under the influence of Nasserist pan-Arabism in the 60s and into the 70s. That was one country. So it's fitting that events regarding Syria seem to have been the main detonator for what has happened in Egypt. Now, the one world source we have for this is the Irish Times, an article published on July 4th in the Irish Times. Morsi role at Syria rally seen as tipping point for Egypt army. Head of state, Morsi, had attended rally with hardline Islamists calling for holy war in war-torn neighbor. So here's the idea. On the 15th of July, there was a confab of crazies, Sunni Muslim clerics of the apocalyptic type, the kind you don't need in any religion. Forget about what religion it is. The apocalyptic ones, right? The end of the world, end time boys. Well, these are the clerics that he was cavorting with. So this was a rally of hardline extremists operating under religious cover. We'll go through later how this dynamic works. And they were railing against the infidels, right, the kuffar. But these people are takfiris, the holier-than-thou, right? No matter how religious you are, it's not good enough if it's not their brand, right? We've seen this stuff, right? Sectarians, but violent sectarians. So they're all inveighing against the infidels. Who are the infidels? The infidels are the Shiites fighting, and the Alawites certainly, and others, to protect the people who want to protect President Assad of Syria and the opposition against Morsi at home. So here's the key part. Mr. Morsi himself called for foreign intervention in Syria against Assad, leading to a veiled rebuke from the army, which issued an apparently bland but sharp-edged statement the next day, stressing that the only role of the Egyptian army is to protect the borders, the territorial integrity, and the internal peace of Egypt. In other words, Morsi he announced his intention to deploy the Egyptian army against Syria. An Egyptian invasion of Syria was his plan. He wanted aggression against another Arab state using the forces of the Egyptian army, right? You can imagine he'd gotten a phone call from Skull and Bones Kerry saying, hey, Morsi, we pay for your army. Now we want to use it. Attack Syria. And Morsi was willing to try it. So here we have, back to the Irish Times, an officer speaking anonymously says, the armed forces were very alarmed by the Syria conference at a time that the state was going through a major political crisis. You can see how this might have worked, that the U.S. and the British and the French and the Israelis, who knows, were able to go to Morsi and say, look, you've got a rebellion brewing here because of your incompetent rule, because of your sellout to the International Monetary Fund, you have lost all popularity. And the Anglo-American imperialists have this problem that Syria has got to be destroyed. So why don't we put these two together? Dear Morsi, you can solve your problem by starting a foreign war, and in the hysteria and the chauvinism and super patriotism around that, you can then deal with your opposition. Now, obviously, though, there were forces inside the Egyptian army that did not want to do this. And this, I think, is extremely interesting. Who opposed this inside the Egyptian army? Because we then get within 2 weeks, we get the ultimatum from the Egyptian army to Morsi saying, look, make a deal with your opposition. In other words, tone down this stuff, make concessions, go for a coalition government, stop trying to grab all the power, and we'll let you stay in office. And of course, he, in his monomania and his lust for power, he said no. So the problem is, how did that decision by the armed forces mature? Was it, for example, the presence of Nasserist colonels, neo-Nasserist officers in the great tradition of Egypt's President Nasser, who said, we will not allow this? Now, even the head of the armed forces is a new guy now. Tantawi is out. Tantawi was, I think, fired by Morsi, or that's what it looks like. This Tantawi and Einan, you'll remember, were the two U.S. puppets who were getting orders on the telephone from Samantha Power and Michael McFaul in the Obama White House, and they were saying, get Mubarak out now. And they were saying, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am, to Sam Power Sunstein, we might add, since that's her husband, Cass Sunstein, the husband of Samantha Power. So Tantawi and Einan were eased out at various points. So now we have the new guy, Sisi, S-I-S-I. And Sisi is the one that you saw on television reading the ultimatum some days ago, telling Morsi, you are now on notice. If you don't go for a coalition government and conciliatory, inclusive approach, then you will be out. Now, underneath that, I think, though, is this question. Would Egypt attack Syria? And the answer, no. And I think that, even under Mubarak, the answer was always no. You'll recall that when the U.S. wanted to attack Afghanistan under the cover of the 9/11 story, they said to Mubarak, we want Egyptian troops to attack Afghanistan with us. The answer was no. Then in 2003, Bush the younger goes to Mubarak and said, look, we're going to attack Iraq. We want Egyptian troops. No. We want a base in Egypt. No. We want you to have a direct military alliance with Israel. No. We want you to accept the U.S. military umbrella. No. We want you to become the centerpiece of a Sunni coalition that will then attack Syria, Hezbollah, and Iran. And again, it's no, 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 no. This is why Mubarak was overthrown, as I stressed at the time. This was a puppet, if you want, but an entrenched puppet who had the ability to say no. So now we see, though, that there was an attempt to use the Egyptian army to solve the main problem of imperialism right now, which is that Assad is winning. And by overstretch, by going a bridge too far, the imperialists have made their situation even worse, as we see in Egypt. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. It's the 5th of July here in Washington, D.C., about the halfway point of the year. We'll try to look at some longer-term tendencies right now. But immediately it is that the imperialists are desperate in regard to Syria. The death squads are being mopped up. The Syrian Arab army is taking over more and more of Homs, the third largest city The death squads are being driven out of the few neighborhoods that they control in Homs. The Syrian Arab army is advancing, and the fall of Aleppo is now on the horizon. Homs, Aleppo, Deraa, these are the key points that are now within reach of liberation during the summer campaigning season, along with other smaller localities, right? We won't go through the list of smaller areas that are also being freed from the yoke of these crazies. So this is what the imperialists are responding to. As we said, this entire phase that we're going through was defined on June 5th by the fall of Qusair and the immediate hysteria of the British, French, Israelis, neocons, and others, joined by Skull and Bones Kerry. Their concern is an entire secret army of terrorists is in the process of getting wiped out. How are you going to attack Jordan? How are you going to attack Turkey? How are you going to attack these other countries in the near future if they get wiped out? So they turn to Morsi. And Morsi, of course, had his roots, and we'll talk in a minute about the roots of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's a creation of British intelligence. Now, of course, it became more than that over time. When something like that is founded and then lots of people join it, it becomes more complex than simply taking orders from London. But on the other hand, the original sin tends to remain. So Morsi had been going off the deep end lately in this power grab, right? As Hamdin Sabahi, who is the viable candidate to now become the new president of Egypt, the Nasserist Hamdin Sabahi, had said 2012 was the year of overreaching for the Ikhwan, for the Muslim Brotherhood. They had gone crazy. They tried to grab all power. You'll remember the Muslim Brotherhood said, we will not have a candidate for president. Then they had quite a few, and they finally seized the presidency. And once they did that, they tried to seize everything else. They were trying to seize the parliament, the constitutional convention, the presidency, and everything else. So this obviously led to a backlash. So Morsi had done things like this. He had appointed a known terrorist, allegedly a retired terrorist, to be the governor of the province of Luxor. Now, this is interesting. Luxor is in Upper Egypt, right? In other words, south of Cairo, up the Nile towards Sudan. And Luxor is where the pyramids are. So this is the main center for the big pyramids, anyway. There are pyramids in various places, but Giza and so forth, right? And other important ruins. Luxor, up the Nile, is where about 15 years ago, 70 or so foreign tourists were assassinated. They were massacred by this group, Gamma Islamiyah. Gamma Islamiyah was Zawahiri, among others, right? The current titular head of Al-Qaeda comes from this, right? The entire Al-Qaeda leadership at a certain point comes out of this Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, right? Al-Masri and people like this. So this group of terrorists had massacred tourists, right? They said, we don't want tourists coming into our country. These are infidels once again. And the guy who led that is a guy called El Khayat. El Khayat, retired terrorist, right? 15 years ago, superintended the killing of 70 tourists, had then been made the governor of Luxor province. So it's basically El Khayat is saying to Europeans and others, come on down, enjoy the sun, and just don't let the fact that I killed 70 people 15 years ago, don't let that trouble you. Now, of course, this has happened in other countries. You know, Joschka Fischer in Germany was implicated in the death of a cop or a maiming of a cop in the Frankfurt area some years before. Anyway, you get the idea. We have Bill Ayers still running around in the United States. But This is a little bit heavier, right? This is 60 to 70 people killed, and they put them right in where the at the scene of the crime. So he had gone too far, and this is what we then read in this interesting article, which is the notion that a red line somehow was crossed by Morsi. Here we have in this Irish Times article at this confab on the 15th of June. Morsi calls for foreign intervention in Syria against Assad, and the commentary on that is that this was too much. For the army, the Syria rally had crossed, quote, a national security red line, unquote, by encouraging Egyptians to fight abroad, risking the creation of a new generation of jihadists, said Yasser El-Shimi, an analyst with the International Crisis Group, right? We know the International Crisis Group, right? Soros, Brzezinski, but that's what they're saying. At the heart of the military's concern is the history of militant Islam in Egypt, the homeland of al-Qaeda boss Ayman Zawahiri. The military source condemned recent remarks made by retired terrorists allied to Mr. Morsi, who has deepened his ties with the once armed group Jama'a al-Islamiyah. So you get the idea. This would have been a catastrophe. This would have led to a regional war. This would have been a vast massacre on all sides, and nobody in the world would have remained immune to the consequences of mobilizing this large Egyptian army against Syria. So what does this lead us to then? Obviously, our policy here, hands off Syria and impeach John Forbes Kerry of Skull and Bones. We can see that the imperialists are really desperate. They are trying literally everything, and that's what we're seeing all around us. The British, the French, the Israelis, the neocons are so concerned to save this secret army of terrorists that they're trying Obama, Snowden, Kerry, Egypt, the UN, and we'll go through some of the details in a minute back on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. Keep up with everything on Tarpley.net, and in these troubled times, Twitter feed Webster G. Tarpley. A lot of action on Twitter. So, Assad of Syria celebrates the Egyptian coup. It is the downfall of political Islam. And we have to be maybe a little bit more specific of this crazy terrorist variety, right? The kind that leads into the kind of thing you see with al-Qaeda or Jama'a al-Islamiyah or whatever it is. Now, from the imperialist point of view, the problem is to save the death squads of Syria before they're wiped out, because that's what's happening to them. So, as of the 5th of June, 1 month ago today, the fall of Qusair, right? The Syrian flag goes up on the clock tower of Qusair. The black flag of al-Qaeda, the Islamic Emirate of the Levant, comes down. The British and the French scream to Obama, we have proof of chemical weapons. You've got to do something. You've got to bomb Syria. And Obama says no. Then they mobilize Snowden on the same day. Snowden, Glenn Greenwald, NSA, Obama taps your phone, Obama reads your mail, Obama snoops on conferences, Obama listens to every phone call in Europe, 500 million a day or whatever it is. Snowden, as we'll be happy to register in just a minute, this entire Snowden thing is falling apart, and hopefully partly through the efforts of this broadcast and the co-thinkers and others who have contributed to this, because I think that is an important part of the picture. Snowden has not found the immediate media embrace, right? And his merger with Assange has not helped him. It's hurt him a lot. And there's even now a falling out among thieves in that department. We'll get to that in a minute. So they call for Obama. He says no. Snowden, they try Snowden. they do weaken Obama, right? They get him to announce what the U.S. has been doing all the time, which is arming the rebels with these smaller categories of weapons. They get Obama's youth support falls by 18%, and now we have Merkel and the other Euro hypocrites who are yelping and complaining and whining about NSA spying. Those European countries are all participants in NSA spying. They knew everything all along because the NSA facilities are located on their Verschlungene territory, the Euro hypocrites. And any news service that broadcasts that stuff at face value is absolutely crazy. Then we have on the 12th of June, 1 week after the fall of Qusair, attempted coup d'etat in the Principals Committee by Skull and Bones Kerry. Then we have the attempt around the 15th of June when the Skull and Bones action in the Principals Committee fails. 3 days later, they trot out Morsi to say, let's have a jihad, right? And it's not clear. It's not just what the Irish Times thinks, that it's volunteers going. No, this is the Egyptian army going as an organized unit. And in the last couple of days, believe it or not, the British, the French, and I think the U.S. too, have gone back. This is still, the State Department. They've gone back to the United Nations Security Council, and they've said, oh, there's a humanitarian emergency in Homs. We've got to have a humanitarian corridor. In other words, we need a safe zone. We need a cordon sanitaire. We want to start invading Syria under that pretext. And this was vetoed by Russia. Thank you, Russia. So you can see the U.S. and the British are trying everything. Now, for those of us who have been around the block, everything includes Gulf of Tonkin and massive false flag. They're capable of lots of things. They've tried false flag with the chemical weapons. It's not working. The skepticism is high. But now it's time for absolute vigilance and total mobilization. Stop the attack on Syria. Don't worry about who's reading your emails. Make sure that your emails say, hands off Syria, impeach Kerry. We got a lot of people who haven't really done much with their phone calls and emails, who they're concerned about their privacy. We're concerned about something else, the fate of civilization. And that is right now, what happens with Syria is going to determine what happens to your civil liberties for a long time to come. Now, let's just look at Egypt for a minute. First, let us say, we support the ouster of Morsi. We would not do this lightly. This is not done lightly. This would not be done on the basis of internal policy alone, but it is predicated on the fact that Morsi was trying to embroil Egypt in a catastrophic Middle East war by attacking Syria. That's the line. You try to start a war, you're a coup bait. So, however, in order to understand how this has occurred, we've also got to go back a little bit. Remember that the great advantage of the Muslim Brotherhood was that they'd been out of power for 70, 80 years. Right? They'd never been in power. They were founded by British intelligence in the late 1920s to counter and undermine the tendencies for Egyptian nationalism then emerging in the Waft party. Waft was the main sort of normal bourgeois party, and it meant kick the British out. Kick the British out of Egypt. That was the content of nationalism in the Waft. So the British create a counter gang, which is this Muslim Brotherhood. Under Nasser, it's even more shameless. The British and the U.S. use the Muslim Brotherhood as a subversive wrecker operation against Nasser, and it doesn't succeed because, of course, Nasser, with his anti-imperialism and his economic development, as typified by the seizure of the Suez Canal and then used the tolls to build the Aswan High Dam and make modern Egypt possible. The Muslim Brotherhood was mobilized against that, and it didn't work very well. But that's where a lot of modern terrorism comes from, is those struggles in the 60s and into the 70s. So the advantage of the Muslim Brotherhood was that they could simply say, the existing system is corrupt and terrible, give us power and we'll do something about it. And that works fine as long as you're out of power. once you get into power, as I said at the time, I actually said, get them into power and they will discredit themselves. I'd give them enough rope, they will hang themselves, and they have to a large extent. The big thing is the Muslim Brotherhood ran their election campaign last time based on a commitment to raise the standard of living of the average worker and peasant. And they tried to connect this by saying the reason that you're so poor is that there's so much corruption in the system. This is not strictly true. It's mainly a lack of production rather than a problem of distribution, although distribution does play a role. The production side is where the issue is actually decided. But they were able to win on that basis. And then when they get into power, saying, we will raise your standard of living, they then turn around and make a dirty, filthy deal with the International Monetary Fund of Madame Lagarde. Yes, Madame Lagarde. And so this means conditionalities. This means austerity. It means last November 2012, a doubling of the price of gasoline, tremendous resentment, tremendous anger, tremendous sense of betrayal. This is the beginning of the end for Morsi, is when he doubled the price of gasoline. He also increased the sales tax. He announced an intention of raising the sales tax to the point where it could be transformed into a value-added tax. These are regressive taxes. This is exactly the opposite of what he was saying, what he was promising. And then also attempts to chip away or abolish the other Nasser subsidies on bread, cooking oil, household fuel, and other things. Now, Sadat had learned the lesson in 1977. He tried to raise the bread price. Big riot. Sadat backed off. Never tried it again. And this then sets the stage for the fall of Morsi. So we'll be back in just a minute with more about Egypt, Syria, and other topics. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio here on July 5th, Webster Tarpley in Washington. So, the justification for the coup in Egypt is that Morsi was scheming to send the Egyptian army to attack Syria. The Irish Times is wrong to think that he's only talking about sending individual jihadi volunteers. If that had been the case, there would have been no need for the Egyptian army to issue that famous communique of mid-June saying our only job here is to defend the borders of Egypt. They obviously interpreted it as a threat to order them to attack this fellow Arab country. So this is what it was. However, from the internal political point of view, Morsi's self-destruction is based on his capitulation to the International Monetary Fund and their absolutely destructive conditionalities, their austerity program, and their destruction of national sovereignty, and so forth. So that is, I think, the basis for saying that this coup is justified. Again, we don't do that lightly. We're not, coup artists here, anything but. However, in order to avoid this catastrophic war, I think that puts it in a different light. Now, what's the way out of this? There is a grave danger of chaos. There's a grave danger of civil war. There's a grave danger of the Algerian scenario, where the Muslim Brotherhood then decide that they're going to start an internal guerrilla war. There's the kind of thing that the Muslim Brotherhood did in Egypt in the 1950s and 60s, which is a kind of a low-level terrorist resistance. The problem the Muslim Brotherhood now has is that they've had power and they've abused it and misused it. And above all, on the main issue, did you raise the living standard of the average worker or peasant? No, they didn't do that. They did the opposite. They used regressive taxation. So austerity is the thing that killed the Morsi presidency. Good lesson to learn, governments around the world. No austerity under no circumstances, and no IMF. Now, of course, most of the coverage simply ignores this. The other thing that's being ignored is, who's the opposition? They say, they're a leftist. Well, I think by leftist they mean Hamdin Sabahi, who's actually a Nasserist. It's not quite the same thing. You'll recall last year, about a year ago, there was a two-part election campaign, and in the first round, You had Morsi come in with 25%, and then you had the army candidate, whose name, this is a non-entity, and then 700,000 votes behind the army candidate. You had Hamdin Sabahi, the candidate of the Nasserist tradition, and everybody was surprised because Morsi had the apparat of the Muslim Brotherhood. The second guy, Shafiq, I think, he came in with the army and their entire complex of interests. Sabahi didn't seem to have an apparat, but he still got 21% of the vote. So Morsi 25%, Sabahi 21%, and the army guy in the middle, but just a little bit ahead of Sabahi. Now, I say that Sabahi he's first of all the victim of a conspiracy of silence in the Western media. They don't want you to know that this exists, but it does exist, and this is the viable alternative. This is the viable way out. The campaign that Sabahi ran last year was, first of all, no to the Islamists, no to the neoliberals. So no to the Muslim Brotherhood and no to the International Monetary Fund and their killer genocidal austerity. There's already a lot. It's the Dignity Party, the Democratic Nasserist. Sabahi, his platform was essentially the Franklin D. Roosevelt 1944 Economic Bill of Rights. Let's go through it. Hamdin Sabahi says that his commitment to the people of Egypt, and he wants to be judged, is housing, health care, food, free education, jobs, social insurance, right, a pension, fair wages, and a clean environment. Right? Absolutely key in polluted third world countries. And what he means by environment is the kind of pollution that harms people, not some theoretical construct about carbon and global warming, but the kind of thing that gives you cancer or skin diseases or whatever the case may be. In terms of food, Egypt needs to increase food production. It's the biggest world importer of wheat. This is used by the United States as the main tool of blackmail, and I've seen that on many, many occasions, even sometimes when I was involved in certain negotiations, which I guess someday I'll write about. But the food part is important. Fair wages. You've got to increase the arable land of Egypt by about 20 million acres, and one of the things is the Second Nile. And you've got to find some way to divert water or bring up water from the desert and use that then for cultivation. Here's another good one. Instead of increasing the sales tax, or even worse, going to a value-added tax, Hamdin Sabahi says, let's have a career tax. The career tax is that if you have more than 50 million Egyptian pounds, Egyptian pound about 7 to a U.S. dollar, I would say. So if you have more than about 7 million U.S. dollars, if you're a millionaire 7 times over, come on, a 10% one-time career tax will be levied. One time, 10% of your assets, not income, total assets, everything you've got, 10%. This is to redress the imbalances created during the bad old days of Mubarak, right? Because there were, of course, tremendous wealth disparities. So it's only in the second round, after Sabahi was removed from contention by 700,000 votes, that Morsi got 38% of the vote. And, of course, then he went along making up the Constitution as he went, right? After he'd gotten into power last summer, then last November, around the time that he caved in and capitulated to the IMF and their usury, right, which is very un-Islamic, that's when he said, I have a constitutional decree, I'm above the law, no court can review me, and so on and so on and so on. So the IMF loan and everything that goes with that is the key part. Now, there is a line, it's coming from al-Baradei. Don't trust al-Baradei. Al-Baradei is a snake. Al-Baradei gets on television and says, we've got to make hard decisions now. He's essentially saying, we need austerity. Can you believe it? We need an austerity program, says El Baradei, but we've got to be careful that there are safeguards built in so that the poorest don't get slammed. This is absolute demagogy, bankrupt and vile, and it shows you that you can't be an Egyptian if you're also an imperialist puppet. National Public Radio this morning had some woman who announced herself as an Egypt economic blogger who did pretty much the same thing, right? We got to make tough decisions. We got to do something, to stabilize the pound, but let's take some measures to make sure that the poorest don't pay the big price. So what we can, I think, hope for is and again, this is a hypothesis, but I think it's there must be forces inside the army that really got riled up with this proposal by Morsi to send them against another Arab country. In other words, practically the same country, right? The one part of the United Arab Republic, X, was supposed to attack another part of the ex-United Arab Republic for the greater glory of the U.S., the British, the French, the Israelis, the neocons, and Kerry. And this is apparently what Kerry was working on in his Nantucket vacation. Right? A lot of people are riled up because he's on Nantucket. So that's the internal situation. There've got to be Nasserist colonels or other Nasserist officers in that army. The combination of the Nasserist current in the army with Sabahi that I think is the winning card. And I urge everybody, get to it, get on Twitter, talk up Sabahi, Sabbahi or Sabahi, usual problem of transliteration of Arabic. We'll be back in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. So welcome back to World Crisis Radio for the 5th of July, 2013. We just had the anniversaries of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the saving of the United States and the saving of the world, as we hope to point out this week and in coming weeks. But now we've looked at the blowback, in effect, the imperialist Anglo-American attempt to mobilize the Egyptian army to pull their chestnuts out of the fire in Syria. It doesn't work, right? Turkey was supposed to attack. They've pulled back. The imperialists are trying literally everything, and it makes it very, very dangerous right now. Again, Turkey, Obama, Snowden, Kerry, Egypt, United Nations, on and on. They're trying every available avenue. You got to think of what else they could try. There's even the possibility of a war with Ethiopia. Right? You could stoke some kind of a conflict over the Nile, which has been latent because of various water projects on the Ethiopian side. Those are great projects, and they should do them. But you can see the imperialists might try to create problems there now to punish the Egyptian army, force them to attack Syria after all. So this is our current situation. Now let's look at the Snowden angle, right? Snowden, the CIA provocateur. Snowden, the protagonist of a limited hangout operation. Now it was clear that his machine had gone off this operation, right? China wanted him out. They don't want to be troubled by this guy, right? It's not worth it. Putin says this whole thing is like shearing a pig, lots of squealing, very little result. And then we've even got more. We've got President Maduro of Venezuela speaking from Moscow on RT says maybe Snowden is being manipulated. A British academic by the name of James Boys, B-O-Y-S, from King's College London, said a day or two ago, he wondered, who pulls the strings of Snowden? So these are good questions, indicating growing skepticism. Now, we've also got conflicts inside this cartel, right? A lot of it grows out of the fact that Snowden has now revealed himself as a subsidiary of Assange and WikiLeaks. I don't think anybody really believes that Snowden is actually in a transit lounge. Well, he's not in the normal transit lounge because obviously news services have sent reporters through there, right? You send a reporter from Tokyo to someplace else with a 15-hour layover in Moscow, and then you've got them in the transit lounge, and then you look around, right? So they've done that. The Washington Post has done it. The Washington Post today concludes, this is just en passant, for 12 days, Snowden has been hidden in a mile-long transit corridor of Sheremetyevo Airport. And they show you a map here on page A4 of the Washington Post of today. Despite intensive searches by reporters, nobody has seen Snowden in the airport's transit zone, setting off speculation that he may be in Terminal A, which is restricted to officials and those who use private planes. Well, undoubtedly they can, if you want to know something, you can get a private plane and try that. But you get the idea. My personal idea is that Snowden is probably in some kind of a safe house where he's being debriefed. Fine, that's what happens in this big world. The degree of hypocrisy on this issue is very high. Snowden is a provocateur, and he's causing trouble. He's succeeding in causing maybe not as much trouble and not the kind that his handlers wanted, but trouble. The joining with Assange means that you're joining an operation, WikiLeaks, which was godfathered by Cass Sunstein in his infamous article, Brave New Wiki World, February 2007 in the Washington Post, and you're joining a cognitive infiltration operation called for by Cass Sunstein in his paper about cognitive infiltration to wreck popular movements that threaten the goals of the regime. And that would mean today a peace movement, right, to try to stop this. It meant 9/11 truth, people who don't like covert operations, who are skeptical about all these things. So, again, Snowden comes forward with stuff that we knew since Echelon, Trailblazer, warrantless wiretapping, the Comey-Ashcroft versus Karl Rove and so forth, right? And Gonzalez. We know all this stuff, but now it's all dished up as new and all then tied around Obama, which obviously Obama is guilty enough. But the purpose of all this is to get Obama to go beyond his divine plan, DEVINE, into the realm of a big war with a big air war and a big land war in the Levant, in Syria. So once you join with Assange, you have joined this very smelly international operation, and you see these characters on television. These are, what can I say? You wouldn't buy a used car from any of the spokespeople that they put on. Now, we have the complaint of Snowden's father. Lonnie Snowden complains that Assange is attempting to control access to his son. Lonnie Snowden says, Assange won't let me, the father, talk to my son, Ed Snowden. The father doesn't like the presence of WikiLeaks. He wants WikiLeaks to butt out. He's correct. It is the kiss of death. It means that all the enemies of WikiLeaks then turn against you, and you begin to acquire that Cass Sunstein pedigree. We've also got Glenn Greenwald, right? The what can we say? The entertainment entrepreneur, right? The risque producer or risque backer of various XXX-rated films coming out of Brazil. Anyway, Glenn Greenwald says that a statement issued this week in the name of Snowden was not actually issued by Snowden. Greenwald says this statement, which is being circulated by WikiLeaks, was not written by Snowden. I think he's suggesting that Assange wrote it. Now, with Assange, there's this idea that little Lord Julian Assange, he wants to get the spotlight where Manning suffers in the prison, right? He's under solitary confinement. He can't make any statements. but little Lord Julian can. And the idea then is that maybe if Snowden were also in solitary, then little Lord Julian could then come out and speak in the name of both of them. This seems to be part of the idea. It's a very, very treacherous operation. However, other elements. The lawyer for Snowden's father is Bruce Fein, F-E-I-N, and the one thing we find out about Bruce Fein is that he has been a speaker at various conferences sponsored by LaRouche, the LaRouche movement, the Schiller Institute. So isn't that interesting? And this then, again, we're right in the thick of the intelligence community with all this. Then we have the certainly justified anger of the Latin American presidents Morales, Correa, Maduro, and Kirchner, all very angry about the fact that the aircraft of Morales of Bolivia was forced to land in Austria, that it looks like France, Italy, Portugal denied it the use of airspace. And, of course, that is a violation of the international norms, and that's very bad. But what it shows is that Snowden is an agent provocateur. His job is to create trouble, and he does it. And he's up there. We'll get to the Euro hypocrites in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Let's just look at the Euro hypocrites. This is where, unfortunately, we have to laugh. We have Merkel shocked that NSA spying is going on. The French Interior Minister yesterday attending the garden party of the U.S. ambassador in Paris for the 4th of July abruptly began denouncing the United States for spying. And, of course, the reality is these governments are all active, knowing, and willing, and eager participants in the spying, which they share, right? They get, if not as much as the British, they get a large part of the spying. In other words, the National Security Agency has facilities on the territory of these countries. What do you think they're doing? Of course, they're spying on the host countries, among others. So these Euro hypocrites, they give us a moment of comic relief. These are governments that cooperated. They knew everything. They knew everything all along. And now, like Claude Rains in Casablanca, shocked that gambling is going on. You're winning, sir. Now, we have Wayne Madsen, a veteran of the National Security Agency, right, and a critic, of course. He wrote an article which did appear for a short time in the London Observer and the London Guardian, where he says there's a system in the NSA. The first party is the United States. The second party is basically echelon, U.S., British, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Well, forget the U.S., but Canada, British, Australia, New Zealand. Then that's the Anglo-Saxon inner circle. And then the third level, the British and the French, maybe the Italians. Fourth level, Poland, and a couple of others. So he just simply wrote this up. It was an interview published in there. So it gets up there, and then it comes right down. The wonderful defenders of truth at The Guardian censor their own article because it undercuts this crazy story that the Europeans are innocent babes who are victims of the evil scheming of the National Security Agency. Now, of course, we're against all of this, but the humor is just unavoidable. Remember also, though, as Greenwald has said, that Greenwald, at least up until a week ago, was saying that this is not like WikiLeaks and Assange, because the thing that got Assange in trouble with the New York Times, Le Monde, El País, Spiegel, and the rest of them, right? The cartel. The way he lost his cartel was he began dumping stuff that had not been vetted, right? He began dumping sort of raw intelligence, and this they don't like, because you might get something of value. It's possible. They want to have it combed out. So Greenwald said, look, you have to give credit to Snowden because he gives the stuff to the London Guardian, that is to say Greenwald, and to the Washington Post, right? To the Washington Post reporter who also broke the story around a little bit later, around the same time. Snowden allows his material to be censored by the Guardian and the Washington Post. Now, come on, by the left wing of British intelligence and by the House organ of the Federal Reserve System? That's a hell of a whistleblower, right? That's radical, dude. So that's what Snowden has been doing so far. So this is absolutely this is an ape theater, right? Nobody in the world can believe this. Now, the Kerry coup. The source on this is, of course, the story is that John Forbes Kerry, Skull and Bones Secretary of State of the United States, Boston Brahmin, oligarch, horsey set, married to this Portuguese heiress and gold digger, fortune hunter with the Heinz fortune, that Kerry attempted to start the bombing of Syria on the afternoon of June 12th, probably with help from his friend Haig of the British Foreign Office, who was in Washington at the time. There's one principal source of this, which is an article by Jeffrey Goldberg in Bloomberg. Now, obviously, the intelligence community, not wanting this story to be widely spread, is launching the idea that, you can see it's the Israelis that are really behind this, right? You get the idea. That's absolute garbage. This is a real story, and the motivation of Goldberg is that he wants the bombing to occur, clearly. He's a hawk. He wants you to know that the great Kerry, he's smart enough not to put it in quite these terms, but he wants you to know that Kerry has made an attempt to do the right thing, and that Dempsey and others in the Principals Committee have stopped him from the necessary measure of bombing Syria. Don't believe people who debunk this based on the fact that it's Bloomberg and Goldberg, right? That you can see what they're trying to do. No, this is a real story. This is what happened. This is Kerry. He was always more aggressive. As soon as he came in as Secretary of State, the word began to come out. He's more aggressive. He wants to do more. He thinks Obama is too meek on the issue, right? Obama hasn't done what is needed. Now, there's one article in particular that tries to deny this. I simply want to say the author of that article is someone who, according to, I believe, his own statements, but certainly the published accounts on the Internet, is a Pentagon contractor in his own right. That's number one. He is supposedly, according to published reports on the Internet, a close personal friend of George Tenet, the former head of the CIA. And you can also find him saying that there are space aliens, there are nations of space aliens, he claims, and that the United States has treaties with some of these space aliens going back to 1977, Kissinger time. And that there's a whole underground civilization in North America that we're not aware of. It's all underground. So Pentagon, Tenet, the Martians, the flying saucers, and the underground world, right? I guess that's the world of the trolls, right? The troll lived under a bridge, right? The troll lived underground. So the trolls. So this guy is from the land of the trolls. So I think the Kerry coup is absolutely fundamental, and he needs to be impeached. There needs to be an investigation of an attempt by a cabinet officer to repeat what Al Gore did in March of 1999, starting the bombing of Serbia, what Kissinger did in October 1973, taking a giant step towards worldwide thermonuclear war. That's the kind of stuff that we're into right here. So we'll be back in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Now, let's devote a segment, or part of one at least, to this question of the Muslim Brotherhood and how this really amounts to cultural populism. It allows us to sum up some of our main principles from a slightly new frame of reference. Remember, cultural populism is a fraud. It's a sham. The idea that you're going to use whatever it is, Indiana values or Texas values, and make a political campaign on this. No, 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 no. The kind of populism we need is economic populism that delivers the goods with specific commitments to wages, jobs, full employment, standard of living, health benefits, economic Bill of Rights. This is what we need. You can call that economic populism. You can certainly make a case that Plato himself was a populist in that sense. But the cultural populism is demagogy, and it leads towards fascism, right? Many elements of fascism. The racist element of fascism in particular is a form of cultural populism, we may say. So in that sense, the cultural populism has to be very much distrusted. But these are two different things. Now, you look at the Muslim Brotherhood. Who are they? They're rich people, rich businessmen, doctors, lawyers, professors, editors. This is the wealthy elite of these societies. If it's not the 1%, it's maybe the 3% or the 5%. But that's who it is. The Muslim Brotherhood supposedly about 100,000 cadres in Egypt, and these are people with money. So now they're interested in oligarchy. They want a society that does what they want, principally economically when you look at it. But you can't campaign for that simply by saying we're the rich elite of this society, so give us power because we deserve to have it. You've got to add something more. And this goes for the Republican Party of the United States or the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood then comes forward and says, we are here for social service, for social solidarity. We fund clinics, we fund hospitals, we fund soup kitchens, and we do social work. And this is fine as far as it goes. Of course, there is a big difference between what you receive as charity and what is yours as a matter of right, and what is actually built into the structure of society so that it raises the entire tenor of everybody's life rather than just emergency interventions for people who are in distress. You get the idea. So the Republican Party of the United States, it's essentially a group of warmongers, right, the neocons, Wall Street money people. With that, you can't organize a party to say, we're the money people and we're the warmongers, vote for us. You've got to add all this other stuff about abortion and social issues so that you can get the big battalions, which are the Christian fundamentalists. You've somehow got to dupe them. You've got to dupe them about the role of Israel, the role of Wall Street, whatever it is, and the libertarians, right? Don't forget, right? If you're voting for Ron Paul or Rand Paul, that's a Republican, and they will vote for the Republican, right? When push comes to shove, when their vote is needed, put it that way, right? Ron Paul voted for the post 9/11 authorization to use military force, which is the origin of everything, even before you get to the Patriot Act. All right. So in the Muslim society, cultural populism appeals to people who are sincerely bewildered by the world. They don't like globalization. They don't like foreign influences. They don't like the fact that so much of Western civilization is pornographic. So you get them on retreating to traditional values, right? Traditional values would mean something like Sharia law. The goal of the Muslim Brotherhood is not the Sharia law. Their goal is, again, primarily economic and to have power. You can see that they're absolutely obsessed with power. But in order to do that, you've got to have this other dimension. Now, let's just do a comparison. Let's go back to France in the 1500s, right? The period of the French wars of religion, right? So it's the idea that Calvinism is coming into France from Geneva, from Calvin, and it is embraced above all by the nobility, by people in all walks of life, but above all by the nobility. Now, how does that work? Well, the program of the French nobility is power. It is, as long as there's a king, to rebel under the great King Louis XI in the 1480s. Around then, you have the League of the Public Good, which is the entire feudal aristocracy of France with the Burgundians, right, with Charles the Foolhardy, Charles the Téméraire. They rebel against Louis XI. So in this case, the nobility says, we're rebelling, right? The eternal proposition is the French nobility is revolting. It's always true. They're always revolting. So in the 1470s, 1480s, 1490s, they say, we're the public good, support us. Well, Louis XI defeats them. Later on, in the 1600s, you're going to have the French nobility saying, we're the atheists, we're the libertines, join us, 1600s, 1700s, to the revolution. In the 1800s, the French nobility still wants power, but now, after the revolution and with the Republic, they become monarchists and devout Catholics. They had been atheists in the 1600s and 1700s, then they become devout Catholics and monarchists in the 1800s and the 1900s, and to some cases to our own time. One of the turning points is in the 1500s. The French nobility decide to embrace Calvinism. And I want to go back to a very interesting history. This is Enrico Caterino d'Avila, a Venetian, who's on the scene in France in the 1560s, 1570s. And he recounts, this is not exactly documented, but it's the truth of the matter, I would say. He says, in effect, there was a meeting of the French nobility, and they're all seditious, right? So they say, how do we rebel against the king with success? The Prince of Condé says, let's start a war right away. But Admiral Coligny says, no, let's use industry and art because we're too weak. And we've got to arrange secretly, without revealing ourselves, that we get to this point with the help of others. And they say it would be highly expedient to take on the religious color of Calvinism so that we could mobilize multitudes of people all over the kingdom who have embraced the religious opinions recently introduced by Calvin. We can increase our strength by a great number of followers. We can get alliances with Protestant princes in Germany, Queen Elizabeth of England. We can put a better face on our cause. We can lay the burden of so bold an attempt on others. We can pretend that it's for the benefit of others. And it will not look as if we're serving our own demand for power, but that we're trying to fight a principled struggle for a religious point of view. You get the idea? The French nobility wants to revolt, but they need a religious cover, and that is Calvinism. And this is the cloak. Calvinism is the cloak for attempting, under certain circumstances, to act out the rebellion of the French nobility against the monarchy in this period of the Wars of Religions, 1560, 70, 80, up until almost the end of the century, right when Henry IV finally puts an end to this. So this is what's going on. And learn this principle, you will see through a lot of shams, right? Because it's cultural populism expressed as religion. We'll be back in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This article in the Washington Post about where is Snowden. He's not in the normal transit corridor. Here we read, Russians are a little bemused at all the fuss over surveillance. Many believe that the authorities can read their mail at will, listen in on their calls, and sprinkle bugs, microphones, around as they please. Quote, wiretapping is so common, so this is not news, said Alina Gorchakova, 48-year-old account manager who stopped to talk to a Washington Post reporter in the street. You get the idea, right? There's a certain degree of realism there. All right. Now, since we've had the Civil War anniversaries, right? Gettysburg and Vicksburg. Gettysburg 1, 2, 3, July. The end of the siege of Vicksburg on the 4th of July, and we've had the 4th of July, and we're going through other anniversaries. Let's go back and look at what this actually meant, right? The project of the Confederate States of America. Just a few quick comments, right, that people can follow up on. Remember that secession was the product of a network, right? It's a product of the spread of the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry at that time with a center, a kind of a sub-center in Cincinnati. That's not where it's headquartered now, but that was the operational point. And essentially this sent out operatives to the various secession conventions, right? And this was not easy to do. And in many states, this was done by a small and highly organized, determined minority. But once you put it into motion, of course, it's kind of like the Cold War. It takes on a life of its own. The goal of this, of course, the center of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry is Britain. It takes place, the secessionism takes place at the height of the world power of the British Empire. British Empire is at its height between 1848, when the various European governments, Metternich and Louis Philippe, go down, and the British are left standing. Everybody falls except Russia, and then the British start a series of attacks. They attack Russia with the Crimean War. They have been attacking China with the Opium Wars. They do the Great Mutiny in India to increase the power of the British East India Company and to massacre people, show them who's boss in India. The French under Napoleon III are puppets, continental dagger for the British. They are key in the Crimean War in the early 1850s. The French then go and attack Indochina. And then shortly thereafter, once the U.S. is embroiled in civil war, the French attack Mexico and invade Mexico. The Spanish re-seize Santo Domingo, right, the Dominican Republic, during the time of the American Civil War. So there's an attempt to undermine the Monroe Doctrine while the U.S. is tied up with this Civil War. At the end of the war, of course, Lincoln or Johnson send Sherman with 100,000 U.S. Veterans to the border with Mexico, and this is part of getting rid of Maximilian and that French-backed regime. So he pays the price in the Cierre de las Campanas. So that's the context. Now, the period of British total domination is marked, the end of it comes with the victory of Lincoln in the Civil War and the unification of Germany under Bismarck, because the power constellation is the ones that would tend to go together would be the United States, Russia, and Prussia, perhaps Italy. This is not so clear. And on the other side, the British, the French, Spain, Portugal, and possibly Austria-Hungary. And the key moment in this international dimension, as we've been stressing, the arrival of the Russian fleets in New York and in San Francisco in September, October 1863. So we're going to have the 150th anniversary, and we should prepare to do something to commemorate this, because along with Gettysburg, Vicksburg means that Lee can't capture Washington. Vicksburg means that the Confederacy is denied the Mississippi, and Arkansas and Texas and much of Louisiana are then cut off. But the international dimension is you could still have an attack by the British and the French, but this is stopped by the Russian fleets. Now, it's not so much the Russian fleets, which are not that powerful, although they have certain capabilities, but it's the idea that there are these huge land armies, right, the biggest in the world, that are backing up those fleets, and that those, might come knocking in Paris. Remember, in the Napoleonic Wars, the Russians had made it all the way to Paris, which they occupied. The word bistro is bistra, meaning fast. The Russians would say, serve us right away, give us a drink, and make it snappy. Then that's bistra. All right. So the Confederate project is not just the southern states. Remember, slavery is a form of primitive accumulation. It creates zero absolute profit. The real absolute profit under slavery is negative because it does not develop labor, it does not develop land. It's a process of primitive accumulation against labor and land, and therefore it destroys the slaves and it destroys the land. And therefore it has to spread because it uses up the areas, right? So this is the main question of slavery in the territories, is that slavery has got to expand in order for its vile life to exist. And the plan, there is in the London Economist in the 1850s and 1860s a discussion of what this new slave empire is going to look like. And it's referred to in primary sources of the time, the idea that the Confederacy, once established, will extend itself into Mexico, the Caribbean, into Latin America, and there would have been no end to this because it's simply a project of destruction until it ran into effective military resistance. So thank God it ran into that military resistance earlier on. So what we need to do is get away from the battles and leaders approach, right? If you look at the papers that were given, the various talks at the tent at the Visitor Center in Gettysburg in particular, these are fascinating, of course, but you see that the people are being drawn into the cliques of the Army of the Potomac, right? The Army of the Potomac was dominated by the politics of the eastern states. And this is bad news. A lot of Democrats, right? A lot of very dubious Democrats, above all McClellan, but people like Burnside. In other words, people who didn't understand the nature of total war. They wanted to do cabinet warfare. They wanted negotiated solutions. Many of them were favorable to slavery. They wanted to keep that. The class origins of McClellan in the Philadelphia aristocracy or the Philadelphia upper crust, this is absolutely determining. Lincoln is correct. The only way you can win the war is to use the lever of slavery, to deprive the Confederacy of the services of slaves and to enroll them into the Union Army. And eventually it's almost 250,000 U.S. Forces who are African-American, black, in many cases former slaves. So that radicalization is absolutely essential, but there are a lot of people who don't want that. And it's amazing how far up that goes. But one of the great benefits of Grant is that he says, yes, we're going to have former slaves become troops, and they're going to fight very well, and they did. And there are any number of such examples. So rather than simply focus on, did Sickles and Meade get along, or, was Howard, the Republican, the odd man out, and so forth, it's important to get this worldwide significance, right? What was really at stake? Gettysburg was the battle for the world, because if it had been lost, much of the world would have gone into a nightmare of slavery and primitive accumulation. And the final lesson is never again. Don't let anybody bring this back. So Rick Perry is a madman. Anybody calling for an armed march or guns in Washington, D.C. is a madman. They deserve to be isolated and denounced. And no two ways about it. So never again. The main goal of politics is to avoid civil war at virtually any cost. And we'll be back next week on World Crisis Radio.